There's two big crises in the world right now. One is a hot war, and one is an emerging Cold War. The hot war is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I think has to be the number one geopolitical event of the year. But I also think we have to keep an eye on China.
Well, it is a great pleasure to have with us Peter Spiegel, US Managing Editor of the Financial Times, overseeing editorial operations in the United States and the Americas from its regional headquarters in New York. Peter, thank you very much for having this discussion with me, being with Elia Map series of podcasts.
It's great to be here.
And my first question to you is, do you see the war in Ukraine ending anytime soon? And can you predict maybe how it will end?
Mhm.
I think that's the question of the year.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I've been asking senior U.S. officials this very question repeatedly in the recent weeks and months, and I yet to have a convincing answer. And I think the one senior official I talked to most recently at the White House said to me that that they believe they have no idea either. You ask three people, you get four different answers as to how this ends. So I don't think anyone really knows. I think what the U.S. government is preparing, particularly in the Pentagon, is a long, protracted war. We're not talking months; we're talking potentially years. I think, in their view, and this is probably not good for the Ukrainians. I think the view is that the longer things go on, the more time there is for the Russians to rebuild, reconstitute their forces, as well as for the allies, for NATO and for the West in general, to begin to divide. And we begin to see some of those cracks already with the obviously the Hungarians have always been slightly difficult on this, but the Italian elections where you've seen some sort of pro-Russian parties get into the coalition government. Sweden also, some of the elections there where we've had the Ukraine war become a bit of an issue. So there is concern in the White House that the longer this goes on, the harder it is for the Ukrainians. And I think the Ukrainians know this. And I think that's why, although a lot of the analysts have been saying, oh, the war was going to quiet down during the winter, I think with the noise you've been hearing out of Kiev is that the Ukrainians feel they can't slow down. They need to keep up the fight because if they're afraid the West will begin to Ukraine fatigue, for lack of a better word, and are afraid if Ukraine fatigue sets in, that the West will begin to back off in its aid. So the short answer to your question is I don't think anyone knows, and I think frankly anyone who tells you they know how this is going to end is not being truthful. I think it's going to be a long, hard slog, and I think we don't have any idea how this goes.
So, do you think that in 2022, that was the most big event that happened in, if you can say the war, an event, of course, that happened?
Look, I think
Um,
there's two big crises in the world right now. One is a hot war, and one is an emerging Cold War. The hot war is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I think has to be the number one geopolitical event of the year. But I also think we have to keep an eye on China. And I think if you were to actually wander around the Pentagon, as I do occasionally, and talk to senior officials, they are actually still much more concerned about China and Taiwan than they are the knock-on effects of Russia. I mean, Russia is in many ways a regional war. They're beginning increasingly view Russians as a second-class power that it really can do. I mean, obviously being able to sort of stir global problems on energy supplies, but really are not a global power that's going to affect the global geopolitics. China is a power that they fear will change the world if they decide to. There's increasing concern about Xi's determination to invade Taiwan, to take it over in some ways. Now, the time clock may have changed. Again, some of the people I've talked to said the one thing that Xi has learned from the Ukraine invasion is you don't go in small and ham-handed. You go in big, and so maybe this takes him, longer amount of time to get up the forces that he feels necessary to invade Taiwan. But there's a lot of people in the Pentagon who are convinced it's going to happen. So obviously that's not an event that happened in 2022, but we saw a lot of belligerence rhetorically. We saw a lot of concern in the U.S. and other Western capitals about this. So I think if you were to rank the events that 2022 will be remembered for geopolitically, one will be Ukraine and one B will be the ratcheting up of tensions between the U.S. and China over Taiwan.
Yes, but do you think that China would do something like that? I mean, I always had the perception that China wanted to conquer the world, but through trade, through economics, through technology, and not through a traditional kind of war, a kind of war that Putin is doing now in Ukraine.
Well, I think, again, to get back to what happened in 2022, the key event here, I think, is the Communist Party conference. They had where Xi Jinping gained his third term as president, unprecedented in the communist era. Um, and the Politburo, which he appointed, are less economic technocrats who care about trade and deregulation and the economy, and care much more about military affairs, geopolitics. That Politburo he has appointed is very much more focused on foreign and military affairs, and that I think is a signal where his brain is right now. He wants his legacy, and again, I'm relying on the Western intelligence sources on this, so I obviously don't have any great insight myself. I have not talked to Xi Jinping recently, but the intelligence people I have talked to say that he believes his legacy will be bringing Taiwan back into the fold, either through peace or by other means. And they believe he's determined to do this. And they point to that the Communist Party Congress earlier this year as a turning point, because he does seem to have decided, I'm going to allow the economics and trade to become a secondary issue for my regime, and that military and sort of the big foreign policy muscle is going to be preeminent under this Politburo. So I think the signals are really unsettling coming out of Beijing on that one.
And that one that you said about legacy, that reminds me very much about Putin and his own legacy. When you start hearing about leaders and their legacy, it's something to be afraid now in our times when we talk about these kinds of leaders.
I mean, this has been something that we at the FT in particular, but I think most people in sort of the world of foreign affairs and international events have been focused on quite a bit, which is that relationship between Putin and Xi, right? They are two of the world's most powerful autocrats. They had this, if you remember this, um, they signed this agreement in which they talked about their maximal positions and support of each other just before the Ukraine war broke out. So there is a common, and frankly, both of them view the U.S. as a rival, and so I think the similarities between Xi and Russia. And remember, these are two countries that have a history of going between love and hate. I mean, they're obviously they've fought border wars before, but then also go through periods of great closeness. I think we're one of these periods of great closeness where they both view the world very similarly. They view Taiwan and Ukraine, Putin for Ukraine and Taiwan for Xi, as sort of parts of the empire historically that have been separated by malign Western forces. And as a result, I think they have very similar outlooks on how to regain their rightful status. We've seen that, frankly, in Hong Kong over the last year, although, frankly, it was more 2021. But, she's basically turning Hong Kong into a proper Chinese city, no longer this two systems, one country policy that had been adopted in the immediate aftermath of the British departure. And I think they both view their role as heads of aggrieved once great empires, and that is their legacy is to return them to that former greatness. In the case of Putin, sort of his famous statement that the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. He wants to recreate the Russian Empire, and to a certain extent, what we're seeing from Xi is a recreation of Greater China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, but also expansion of Chinese authority over the Pacific region more widely. The old phrase that the Pacific is a American Ocean. He doesn't want that to be so anymore, and I think we're seeing his efforts in that direction as well. Very similar to what Putin is viewing in terms of Central and Eastern Europe.
So, European Union, do you believe that they must take a good look at that and not be so dependent in China, because the dependency on Russia and not seeing what Vladimir Putin wanted to do got us where we are now, with energy crisis, with gas, with everything, because European Union, Germany believed in Vladimir Putin and they trusted him in a way, in more than one way.
I mean, this is to me probably the most interesting issue to be sort of reevaluation in Europe over the last year, and I'll put it in I'll personalize it. I think it's the reevaluation of Angela Merkel's chancellorship. She left office. You'll remember, and I was in Brussels for the sort of the tail end of her tenure. She was, the world's frankly great liberal hero, particularly when Trump became president and the U.S. president was no longer seen as a reliable ally. She was the last great hope of liberal democracies. She left office on as amongst hosannas of praise. But I think in light of Ukraine, there's been a real evaluation of her tenure as chancellor and Germany's position vis-a-vis not only Russia, but I also think China, because German foreign policy was very much based on the sense that if we trade, we will influence them to become more wedded to the West. And I can remember multiple trips that Merkel took to Beijing, which were clearly almost, mercantilist in their goals. She wanted to sell German goods, the Mittelstand, to Chinese companies. And the geopolitical issues of the day, be it, the Senkaku Islands, where our Japanese allies were fighting with the Chinese over sovereignty, South China Sea, the Germans never want to get involved in terms of geopolitics of that. They just did not want to deal with the hard geopolitics of China. Thought that Trump first, but then to a certain extent Obama as well, were being too hardline against the Chinese. And so I think the sense that Germany has to rethink the way it addresses the world, and we've seen Olaf Scholz announced that the German military spending is going to double over time. I think, to me, again, if we were to look back at 2022 from a distance in 5-10 years from now, that may be the thing we most remember about EU foreign policy. Because I think you're right. I think the Germans, Europe in general, but led by the Germans, completely miscalculated on their reliance on Russian gas. But I also think there's got to be a rethinking about how they have approached China as well, because it is all of Europe, to be honest with you. It's not just Germany in this case. I think the UK in particular, under David Cameron, talked about in this new era of relations with China, that Rishi Sunak most recently, we keep going through prime minister so quickly in Britain, it's sometimes hard to keep up. But Rishi Sunak basically called an end to. I think there's a real reawakening that geopolitics has returned to the world, and it's not just commerce and trade and economics anymore. And I think that's going to really impact the way Europe deals with the world in the future.
Well, Peter, that's now my next question, is that there is a discussion about how liberal democracies are dealing with autocratic regimes, how liberal democracies talk to Saudi Arabians, how they talk to Egypt, how they talk to Russia, how they talk to China, so with Iran. So what is your opinion? Should we engage with them so that the people in these countries have a hope, or should we put them aside and not talk with them? It's a huge discussion about
Yeah,
how liberal democracy should deal with it, with that kind of regimes, which I must say that they're getting more and more in the world.
I guess I would fall on the side of punishment and isolation. I think we have tried, most of the post-war Cold War era has been an attempt to drag these countries into Western norms. And as you said, what we've seen is the opposite direction. We've seen obviously Russia become more authoritarian. We've seen China become more authoritarian. Certainly, Mohammed bin Salman is a more authoritarian figure than I mean, the Saudi royal family is not a democratic in any way, but I think Mohammed bin Salman is more autocratic perhaps than any of his predecessors. And then Western democracies, NATO allies who have gone that direction. Hungary, we talked about. Turkey obviously is headed in that direction. India, I would say, under Modi seems to be going in that direction as well. And I think engagement is been proven to be problematic. It hasn't affected change. And matter of fact, it's freed up a lot of these autocrats to have a free hand in their own countries. The problem we're running into, I think, you mentioned Saudi, but I think India is a similar case. Is Biden came into office, and I think it was very rightly viewed as probably the most anti-Saudi president since World War II. following probably the most pro-Saudi president since World War II in Donald Trump. And what happens? There's a world energy crisis, and Joe Biden is mugged by reality, which is you need the Saudis, particularly when you've sanctioned Venezuela and Iran, and you've got no other really reliable source of energy. So I would say the same thing with India. If you look at India, Modi, particularly on his anti-Muslim policies, his anti-press policies, he is verging in the direction of authoritarianism, and yet we need him on China. The whole idea that the U.S. has done with the Quad, where it's the U.S., Australia, Japan, and India, sort of the three regional powers that could help the U.S. check the Chinese growth. Well, India is becoming a mini authoritarian state, and the U.S., because they need the Indians to check the Chinese, feel unable to push back on Modi's authoritarian tendencies. So, look, it is. I have always been, I guess, an advocate, and it's easy being a journalist, to reinvigorate American foreign policy with the principles and ideologies that have always motivated this country. And I think, that is democracy, that is human rights. And I think a lot of these things became sullied because, basically George W. Bush invaded Iraq, trying to impose democracy at the point of a gun. And Barack Obama came in, and even the Democratic Party, which historically has been the party of human rights and democracy promotion, it became a dirty word. And you saw that clearly through Obama, where his engagement, particularly with the Iranians and other regimes, the Cubans and whatnot, were a little bit more realpolitik, a little bit more Kissingerian, realistic realism. And I think in Biden, you have a guy who has historically been much more on I guess the Dean Acheson wing in the Democratic Party, a very much a values-based foreign policy. Certainly, Tony Blinken comes from that background as well. Came into office talking about democracies versus autocracies and the family of democratic nations and how that was going to return to the core of American foreign policy. And then, boom, Saudi, we need the Saudis. Boom, India, we need the Indians. Boom, for you guys in Greece, Turkey, right? I mean, this is an ally who has been in recent months making some of the most outrageous statements towards Greece and towards Russia, frankly. But we need the Turks on immigration and on Russia. And so you run into a reality that you can't really isolate some of these autocrats without really damaging your own interests. And I think that balance has been very difficult to strike for the Biden administration.
Well, and my last question to you, do you think that the Republicans will win the next presidential elections in the United States and with Trump or DeSantis? Well, and frankly, I don't know which of the two are worse because
Well,
I
look, I mean,
think DeSantis is very focused, and
I think what we have seen is that the last Republican president to win the popular vote, I think, if I'm trying to remember, was George W. Bush against John Kerry. Almost every single Democrat on the popular vote has won the vote. Now, because of the slight strangers to the U.S. electoral college system, we've had Republican presidents who have won without winning the majority of the vote. Both George W. Bush against Al Gore and obviously Donald Trump against Hillary Clinton. So I think if you would just sort of look at the country right now, structurally, the Republicans have an uphill battle. And I think what we saw in the midterms is particularly sort of suburban voters in major American cities are just tired of him. They don't want to vote for him. They think he's gone crazy. They're tired of his, election denialism. And you're seeing that in states that are normally Republican states, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina. These are states that have for generations been Republican states. They're now going to the Democrats. So I think what you're seeing, at least now, and I don't want to say what's going to happen in 2 years, but I think at least now you're seeing the Republican Party really begin to turn off Trump. And it's slightly ironic. I mean, he's done so many outrageous things in the last 6 years, including things that are probably potentially criminal. But the one thing, if you're a Republican office holder, that you cannot stand for is losing elections. And if it now seems that Trump is a weight on the party, you're already beginning to see senior leaders saying we have to move on, which leaves us with DeSantis. And I think DeSantis is a very, very disciplined man. As you said, he's almost, we had a magazine profile of him a couple of weeks back, so we called him Trump with brains, right? Now, I am I think he's a very interesting character for a couple of reasons. One, he has clearly adopted some of the Trump rhetoric, particularly the anti-media rhetoric, the liberal elite rhetoric and stuff like that. But if you look back at his record, when he's in Congress in particular, he actually comes from a more moderate tradition, and was seen as more of a sort of a young reformer than an ideologue and a Trumpista. And I think DeSantis has seized on this rhetoric because he knows that's where the Republican base is right now. But I think in Ron DeSantis, you will have a presidency that is maybe much more akin to a George W. Bush, in which I mean a hard conservative policymaker who is sort of very anti some of the Democratic reform, the center left reforms of the sort of Lyndon Johnson era, but not someone who's insane. Someone who lives within the guardrails of American
Yeah.
policy, not going to try to use the IRS or the US military to invade Mexico or bomb North
Yeah, I
Korea
understand
or
what
these
you
kinds of things.
mean. Yeah.
Yes. So I think DeSantis, I think he may be espousing what that many Democrats certainly, and even some moderate Republicans, may seem as extreme views. But I think a DeSantis presidency would be a hard conservative presidency, but that within the
The,
guardrails of American policy,
yes, the
political
normal. He
debate.
will be a normal
A normal
president,
hard right
hard right
conservative,
conservative.
yes, which
Yes.
we've had before in this country, and we seem to have survived. So,
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you very, very much for this
my pleasure. It's always a
discussion.
pleasure to talk to
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.